I'd like you to think back and remember a time when you did some organization or some cleanup and how you felt about that, whether it was email or files or old records that you no longer needed to keep. You can just feel good about getting stuff cleaned up. Well, we have that same option in DNS with a process called DNS scavenging. And here's how it works. If we have integrated Active Directory and we're doing secure dynamic updates, clients, when they get IP addresses, they can update those records in DNS. However, over time, we may have devices that are no longer on our network. Perhaps people with laptops that come into the corporate office, they log on, they do a dynamic entry in DNS, and then for the rest of the year, they're gone. Well, that person's A record, dynamically updated on the server, along with maybe thousands of others, are just taking up space as records on that server. And we're just wasting space, especially if that computer is no longer part of this topology or this environment. We really don't need to hang on to that A record for an excessive period of time. So what DNS scavenging allows you and I to do is to tell the DNS server, hey, go ahead and automatically clean up records after a period of time if they haven't been updated in a while, referring to the dynamically updated records that are present. So where we're going to set it is we are going to enable scavenging on each of the zones. If you have lots of zones, we can do it in one fell swoop, but it does have to be enabled on the zones for it to work for those zones. And then secondly, we need to go to the server properties and tell the server that we want to automatically scavenge. And we could do this in a couple of different ways. We could use the graphical user interface, and of course there's also PowerShell commands that we could use as well. So I'm going to walk you through the steps of setting up scavenging, and then I'd like you to practice hands-on in our hands-on lab environment. So here on our Windows 10 computer, let's go ahead and launch the DNS Manager using the DNS Manager icon here on the taskbar. And let's go ahead and expand the DC NUG server, and then we'll expand our section for forward lookup zones. And if we want to enable the scavenging feature on a specific zone, we simply go to that zone. We'll click on Nugget Lab as an example, right-click on it, and then from the drop-down, select Properties. And then right here on the General tab, we have an option at the bottom for Set Aging/Scavenging Properties by clicking on the Aging button right here. So we'll click on Aging on this General tab. And if we want to enable scavenging for this zone, we simply put a check right here in this checkbox that says Scavenge Stale Resource Records. Now, besides enabling the feature for this zone, there's two other parameters that we can play with, the no refresh interval and the refresh interval. And it basically goes like this. Let's say Bob, the client, logs on, gets an IP address, does a dynamic update securely because we have DNS integrated with Active Directory, and he does an update and there's a dynamic entry for Bob's IP address associated with his computer name in DNS. And we'll put that as our starting point. We'll call that position 0 in our timeline. Well, after Bob does that update, we then enter
the no refresh interval zone,
which is 7 days by default. So for 7 days, so now we're 7 days in, Bob cannot do a refresh of that record. So let's say Bob has the same IP address for 7 days. He logs on over and over. Maybe he reboots his computer a few times, has the same IP address. That record with that name and that IP address, even if Bob's computer is saying, hey, here's the update, because it's in the window for the no refresh interval, it won't be updated. DNS is not going to bother updating a record with the same information. So then 7 days goes by. And then what we do is we enter the refresh interval, which is going for another 7 days, which would put us out to 14 days. So during this refresh interval right here, Bob's computer, if it logs on, is going to have the opportunity to send a dynamic update and have that refreshed inside of DNS. And if he does so in that time, we go back to the no refresh interval and the cycle starts over. If Bob does not, Bob's computer's gone, he's moved out of the country, whatever. If Bob doesn't do an update in the refresh interval, it's at the end of that 14 days where that record for Bob's computer can now be scavenged. And by default, the scavenging at the server level and on the zone level is not enabled. So what we'll do is we'll go ahead and enable it right here. We'll take the defaults of 7 and 7 for the no refresh and refresh intervals, and we'll go ahead and click on OK. And we'll click on OK again. So that's for the Nugget Lab zone. If we wanted to apply scavenging for all the zones on the DNS server, what we could do is we could go ahead and right-click on the server itself. And from the server drop-down list, we have an option here called Set Aging/Scavenging for all zones. If we click on that, we can go ahead and enable it for all zones. We can specify the time frames for no refresh and refresh and click on OK. And then we can click on the checkbox to apply these to the existing Active Directory integrated zones as well and click on OK. And now scavenging for all of the zones on this DNS server has been enabled. Now the trick is, even though the zones are willing to have scavenging done, the server, by default, isn't going out and scavenging the records. Our next step would be to tell the server we want to do the automatic scavenging. So to do that, we'd click on DC-nug, our DNS server, right-click on it, and then from the drop-down menu, select Properties, and then we're going to click on the Advanced tab for the DNS properties for DC-nug. And then on the bottom half of this window here, we have an option for Enable Automatic Scavenging of Stale Records. That would be records that are past that 14 days based on our other settings in the zones. So we'll put a check in that checkbox to enable it. And that enables the automatic and periodic scavenging of records on the zones that are also allowing scavenging to happen. So we'll go ahead and leave that enabled here and click on OK. Now if we wanted to immediately do the scavenging on the zones that we're allowing it, we could right-click on the DNS server, and from the drop-down, we could select the option Scavenge Stale Resource Records and select that. It's asking for confirmation. We'll go ahead and say yes, and it's just gone out, and any records that were eligible to be scavenged, meaning that were dynamically updated and haven't been touched for 14 days based on our settings, the scavenging is going to remove those records, those stale records, from the zones in which they live. And now, my friend, it is your turn to practice what we've done together in your hands-on lab environment. So have some fun doing it, and I'll see you, my friend, in our very next nugget. Meanwhile, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.